We got a shrink in the house. I guess I'm in your domain.
Right.
Is that a
You should be very afraid. I've got some ink blots, Andrew, I want you to look at, huh?
Yeah. Oh, Rorschach testing?
Yeah.
What do you see? Well, is that a derogatory term? Shrink or? I was going to Google it.
Considering the other words that have been used, I think that's pretty tame.
Where did that come from?
Shrink?
Yeah.
Like taking your brain and shrinking it down into manageable parts that we can understand. We're shrinking it down.
Okay.
I think. I don't even really know. That's a good
That's not derogatory, okay. Because I'm just coming out of the gate swinging. Mm-hmm. So you're a clinical psychologist.
Correct.
And I was Googling, I was looking up your office, and you have is it PsyD?
I do.
Not PhD.
Correct.
What's the difference?
PhDs grow from the top of the cave. The PsyDs grow from the bottom of the cave. You get it? You got it. So PsyDs are, if you think about the traditional PhD, that person goes to a lot of school and then tends to do a lot of research and publish papers, right?
Okay.
PsyDs do the same type of schooling, but instead of getting into the research part of it, we tend to start doing practice early on. So for instance, in my grad school, even when I was getting my master's degree, they already had me seeing clients under the supervision of a licensed person. And so you could think of it as the PhD is more of the researcher type of psychologist. The PsyD tends to be more of the practitioner that actually meets with people.
That's interesting, because how would they, I guess, converge? It seems like the PhDs have to meet with the PsyDs and say, hey, what's going on in the field?
Right. I think there's actually a good interplay between the two, because I'm constantly reviewing the publishing that PhDs do on different types of mental health research that they do, and I want to see what's the research showing is effective in the field, and then I steal from their research and apply it with clients. And I've had a few PhDs over the years that have asked for feedback on what are we seeing in the field that helps better guide their research. So I think it's a good interplay back and forth.
Okay. Yeah, because I didn't know how that would interplay, like you said. And so what's your walk me through like getting to this point, because I mean it's a long, arduous
becoming a psychologist.
Yes, yeah. That seems like a long journey.
So it started with when I was an undergrad student at the University of Missouri. I was majoring in business. I had no idea that I would ever end up in psychology. But one thing that happened was while I was in a business major, I was also working in the summertime at a company called Northrop Grumman. You've probably heard of them. They're a huge defense contractor.
Okay.
They build guidance systems for things like missiles on naval destroyers, but they also build the little devices on semi-trucks that track their positions so their employers know where they are. So I'm working for that company while I'm studying business. And one day it occurred to me that all the stuff I was studying in business, like marketing and economics and advertising and all that kind of stuff and budgets, was not nearly as interesting to me as like why people at work didn't get along with each other and why some people would come into work with their family problems, or there was one day I saw two people get in a fist fight with each other at work, and I thought, that part is much more interesting to me than whatever we're trying to do in this company. And so I thought about it a lot, talked to an advisor and said, how much
I want to do this.
How much lag time am I going to have graduating from this place if I switch my majors? And I was pretty convinced I wanted to do it. I called my dad on the phone and I said, hey, what would you think if I was to change my major from business to psychology? And he had been very successful as a businessman in his life, not in psychology, but in a different field. And he said, why the hell would you want to do that? So that I had to navigate Dad's blessing for a while, but that led to me majoring in psychology. And as you probably know, with a bachelor's degree, you can't really do much of anything. So I went and got my master's degree. While I was in my master's program, I had a supervisor that really kind of mentored me and had me work with some different populations, back to what I was saying about the PsyD emphasis. So I started working in a rotation where I worked with geriatric people, then I did one with kids, then I did one with couples. And honestly, in each of those rotations, I thought to myself, yeah, I don't like doing this. I don't like working with this population of people. So it was really kind of a little bit nerve-wracking that as I was getting closer and closer to being done with my degree, I hadn't really found a population I enjoyed working with. And so this mentor said, hey, why don't you do a rotation at the sheriff's office? And I'd never even thought about that they would use a psychologist in a sheriff's office for anything. But he made me aware that our local sheriff's department allowed psych students to come in there and not only work with some of the staff, but also to do work with the offenders. And I was there probably a couple days, and I was like, "This, I like this."
You found what you found your niche.
Found my little niche, and the rest is history. Yep.
So you're working primarily with first responders.
First responders nowadays, and their immediate family members.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's got to be. I don't know of. I mean, I've never even heard of that before. A psychologist exclusively working with first responders, but
we're one of the few, I think, in the Midwest, honestly, and in Indiana, we may be the only ones that are working exclusively with first responders. In fact, the National Fraternal Order of Police, the FOP, has a website that you can go on, and there's a little tab that says wellness, and you click on the tab, and you can search the entire United States to see where are providers that work with us, first responders.
Yeah.
And I had a really humbling day one time when I clicked on that tab and I searched Indiana, the entire state, and the results were 1. And it showed a dot on the map, and it was me. And I thought, that's a lonely feeling. We're the only people that specialize in this. I think there's a couple more dots nowadays, but
I hope so.
yeah,
Man.
yeah,
Which you're in Indianapolis. I mean, at least you're centrally located. You're in the you're in the heart of the state, but still,
Right.
I mean. So are you seeing a lot of? I would assume PTSD, a lot of anxiety, a lot of. I mean, would that be like the main category of, illnesses, if you wanted to call it that? But
I think there's a lot of, I mean, the research says that if you snagged up 100 people off the street right now working as police officers, you would have somewhere around 15%, maybe 20% of them meet the full criteria for PTSD.
okay,
It's a larger number that maybe don't meet the full criteria, but they got some PTSD noise going on that maybe affects them from time to time. So that's by far the most prominent thing that we see. But alongside that, you see things like anxiety, just regular old anxiety of being out on the street and being very vigilant to somebody's surroundings. Substance use, unfortunately, that comes up, and it's oftentimes a way that the officer is medicating
yeah,
the anxiety, trying to keep it at bay or trying to make it to where they can go to sleep at night.
alcohol generally, yeah.
Yeah, and then, the next morning loading up with energy drinks to get up, so it becomes this cyclical thing.
See, that's how I treat my anxiety. Is I make it worse with coffee and nicotine.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's I'll tell you what, and that So I don't know if I told you this. I grew up in the foster care system.
I remember
and, getting exposed to smokeless tobacco, and I'm like, this is disgusting. And then, God, that was 20 years ago, and like 6 months ago, finally was able to substitute it with something else. But it is, I wanted to delve into something I find really interesting, and it is prominent in, I see it in people older than me. I'm 33. Do you feel like cell phones, social media has a profound effect on people, their mental health?
There's no question about that.
I figured you'd say that, but
Yeah. With police officers in particular, you think back to when COVID came out, and then even the CDC, it's a government agency, said, wash your hands. If you're sick, don't be around people. And they said, monitor your media consumption. Well, why would the government tell me to monitor my media consumption in the middle of a medical situation? And the answer is, the more of that you consume, the more stress that you get. And when I'm more stressed, you know what happens? My immune system plummets, and I become more
Susceptible.
susceptible to the very thing I'm afraid of. So I think in the world of police officers, some of them, and I get it, they read a lot of social media, and a lot of it that's out there, obviously you've got your pro-police crowd, you've got your people that are pretty neutral down the middle, but then you have some really awful, horrible things that are in the media about law enforcement that really can damage a person's psyche and their morale for sure. And in a society where the last 4 or 5 years has been pretty brutal with police officers in their relationship with the community, it's caused some to not want to do this position anymore, work as a police officer. And certainly you and I spoke about recruiting.
Yeah.
Across the country, recruiting to get into this position has been very difficult. So that's probably another thing I hear frequently is officers that are not sure about whether they want to stay in the career, or if they are staying in the career, finding they're being asked to do much more in their position, that they're spread really thin because there's just significant manpower issues.
Yeah, you make a great point. And so I've never brought this up on the channel, but being a police officer, I tell people all the time, like, when you have this acidic environment, people that, are just bashing the police incessantly for whatever, then people, they start to drop off. And it creates an environment where, like you said, you're spread thin, and now you have, and then, I don't want to say, I haven't seen it with my agency, but in a lot of these big metropolitan areas, they are having to, not necessarily lower the standards, but they're relaxing standards.
Right.
They're having to hire bigger groups, and that it's bad news all the way around.
Yeah, I would tell you that there's a couple colleagues I have here in the office, and occasionally we have these conversations with each other like, why is this department sending this person to us to evaluate to be a police officer? They're a nightmare.
Oh.
They've got lots of stuff going on with them, and in some cases the department's well aware of it. And so we'll have to have sort of these tactful, diplomatic conversations with the department about, can you walk us through what risk you're assessing with this applicant? Because we see lots of risk. And so it's, as you say, if the pool of applicants is much smaller, some departments unfortunately water down the quality of the people that they bring on to work with them. And I think I can say it as a citizen, that scares me.
Yeah.
Because I don't feel confident that this person is out there with the best head on their shoulders sometimes. And so, sometimes we have to be the ones that write the report back to the department saying, we don't recommend that you hire this person. And we look like the bad guys, but really,
You got to be a gatekeeper.
we got to be a gatekeeper for the public.
Yeah, I mean, that's your job. At the end of the day, if it's just like, yeah, go ahead. I don't condone it, but go ahead. Yeah, I mean, because you're in these situations all the time where you're in someone's house and they go in their kitchen, they go to get something, and you're left in their living room, or you're left in their bedroom, and you're left in their house, and which I tell people all the time, I am a huge proponent of body cameras. The body camera is going to tell, you're going to have your version of events, I'm going to have mine, and then there's going to be, this footage rolling on my chest, or if they have whatever the case.
And actually, just a point on body cams. In our office, we interviewed just about every police officer that's involved in a shooting in the state of Indiana. They come here and they do what I would call a critical incident debriefing.
Okay.
And we make sure, that they understand there are certain things that can happen during a shooting with your senses and your memory. And we try to make sure that they're coping well afterwards. Body cams have become a huge benefit to officers involved in shootings, because 99% of the time, once they review their body cam footage, their own footage of what happened, they will say, I had a big relief because I thought I saw what I saw, and the camera footage confirmed all of the things. And they're not always watching just their body cams. They may see camera footage from a nearby store or another house that helps them put the picture back together, because a lot of people have memory loss for what happens during a critical incident. It's not that they're lying or that they're trying to get their story right afterwards. It's that they truly can't remember everything. And so the body cams have been huge in helping officers to put the puzzle back together afterwards on what actually happened. And as I said, nearly 100% of the time, it reassures them that they did the right things, and that's a big deal for officers that may feel a little vulnerable after having been through something like that.
Yeah. Is that just because it's a traumatic event for your brain? Your brain is that a method of it shutting down, so to speak, and saying, hey, I'm going to kind of block this out, at least for the time being?
If you think about, like, many officers will say that in the midst of somebody threatening them with their own weapon, that they will have vision that tunnels in. They will have auditory things where they don't hear certain things being said, or it sounds muffled, and their sense of time is often altered by, they watch the body cam footage and they say, man, it felt like that incident lasted for 5 minutes, and I watched it on the body cam and it was over in 30 seconds. The brain does a tremendous job of triaging and going down into the essential information. And, you and I as human beings, the most fundamental instinct we have is survival, right? Okay. So if the brain calculates that something is a risk to our survival, it starts to shut out non-essential information, like, your digestive system, your reproductive system. Those things are not important systems, and it shuts those down so it can allocate resources to fight, flight, whatever you need to do to stay alive. And so if you think about it, if the brain didn't do that, and you had somebody threatening you with a gun in close quarters, and you were very aware of your peripheral vision, like, hey, I like the flower garden that lady has over there in her yard, or I can hear the sound of a car over on the highway, that sounds like a Hemi, or those things would potentially distract you
absolutely.
From the one thing you need to be honed in on. So sometimes I have to try to educate officers that if they feel like, hey, what happened to my senses? My mainframe blew a capacitor and I don't remember certain things, trying to remind them your brain did exactly what it was supposed to do and it kept you alive.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you have someone that has PTSD, I was reading an article, it's about soldiers, but this is more like, I guess, if you wanted to delve into medication, but they're giving them like low dose, is it psilocybin?
Mm-hmm.
Have you heard of that?
Yes, and it's at the moment how can I say it? I'll just say it frankly, it's a very controversial approach. The VA is currently doing clinical trials on lots of different types of psychedelics. At this moment, I'm not aware of the VA authorizing or recommending any of those treatments, and I think the reason they don't is there's unfortunately some people that have tried those, what I'm going to call experimental medications, and died. So you have some cardiac risks alongside the potential benefits. So the approach I take is, if I have a client that's interested in pursuing that, is I try to tell them, you're going to have to educate yourself on the risks and the benefits. And if it has a potential cost of you having a heart attack, I'm not going to recommend it to you. But I'm also sensitive to the fact that if I was really hurting, and I tried everything else, and I wasn't finding benefit, I get it. I would be probably open to trying anything if I thought it would bring me some relief. So you definitely see more people these days trying things like that, and even going out of the United States to other countries where those drugs are legal to see if it will benefit them. So I think the jury's still out on whether those will be approved at some point. And I have talked to a few officers that went and had treatments like that was clearly under medical supervision. I just talked to a guy last week who went to Mexico, and he was talking about how he was attached to an EKG while he's at this treatment facility with apparently a physician and several medical staff that were around him while he went through the treatment. That encourages me that it wasn't just in some back alley somewhere, right, licking a toad.
Go lick this bright blue frog. Probably have the same effect.
Right.
Yeah, I had a guy who was telling me his last name was Doolittle. He was a very colorful character. He's like 5'2", like 100 pounds, still a tiny guy, and he was like, yeah, ayahuasca and this shaman had given him this drink, and they had to like. And I was like, yeah, well, you're 100 pounds, so I mean, you drink 8 ounces of anything, it's probably gonna
Well, even something like cannabis. I mean, Indiana's we're kind of like the only state that doesn't, in this area, have legalized marijuana. I've worked with several officers who tried, let me rephrase that. I've worked with several retired officers who are no longer police officers that have tried medical marijuana to see if it would assist them. And those three that did that, all three of them at one point ended up in the emergency room going through almost like psychotic episodes. And I think the shame is, these guys going out and scoring weed, they don't know what's in it. It's not the weed that our folks grew up on that's out there right now.
Yeah. I tell people all the time, I'm like, that stuff is, especially in Indiana, for the most part, it's not regulated. You're getting it from, whoever down the street.
And how do you know there's not fentanyl laced in it?
Most of the times there is now. I mean, everybody wants a little extra, for their buck. But yeah, the opioid, it is wild. And not to delve into politics, but I guess, it's this whole thing going on with the cartel now because they're the biggest supplier of at least fentanyl that I believe. And I'm not sure. I think a big part of it comes from Asia too, I was reading. But yeah, it is absolutely insane what I'm seeing and what, we're trying to do. And then cannabis now is treated almost like it's like, okay, all right, well.
Well, to go back to our previous point on recruiting, we definitely see a lot more police applicants that have histories of using cannabis, some of them pretty heavily. And there's a pretty healthy debate about, well, how do you evaluate an applicant if they were using cannabis in a state where it was legal at the time? So you get into a lot of, I think, reasonable minds can differ on that. It's still illegal, as I understand it, federally. And you get into situations like, well, not only was the guy using it, he was a pretty heavy dealer. So there's probably a reasonable argument that could be made if you're a recreational user in college and you used it 4 or 5 times versus you were using it thousands of times and dealing it and doing other criminal activity alongside it. Those are apples and oranges to me.
You're seeing that?
Oh, yeah.
Wow. Oh, see, I thought dealing was that was a definite no-go. And I used it a few times. I just didn't like it. And I told my background investigator, I was like, didn't like it. Just wasn't my thing. I liked my Copenhagen and I liked a little bit of alcohol here and there, but I was under, and it wasn't. And growing up in the foster care system, I was a ward of the state, so everything we did was just so heavily scrutinized, and it was. But yeah, I mean, I didn't know that that was the case, and I guess it depends on the agency too. But I mean, I appreciate being around guys that aren't sheltered, because when I tell people, I'm very open about it. I mean, I don't really care. They're like, what? Like, yeah. And I guess you have to.
Do you mean that being open about your background?
Correct. Yeah. And then you have guys that, and it's not, and great for them, but they grew up in the same house, mom and dad. They went to college and they worked at the jail, or they worked at the grocery store. And now they're 21, and guess what? Now they're applying to be police officers, and they are green as. Yeah.
So this will encourage you. There was a psychologist that did a study called Too Good to Be Blue. And what he did was, I think he's up in the Portland, Oregon area. He did a lot of research on the numbers of people that were applying to Portland PD, and were there things that seemed to predict whether they would crash and burn as officers or not. Because obviously, if we can pinpoint what the predictors are, that makes selection a lot easier, right? So he's digging into the data, and he's looking at things like, what were their written aptitudes test scores? What was their high school GPA? If they went to college, what was their college GPA? Yeah. What was their oral interview score? What was their physical agility score? What was their credit score? What was their scores on all of the tests that are on the psych instruments that we use with applicants? And his research showed the single best predictor of somebody not being a good police officer was that they had a crystal clear background. That they were too purely driven snow type of applicants. Now, whenever I share that study with departments and especially HR people, you get this weird look at you like, well, now wait a minute. for for decades we've been looking for the Eagle Scout that was, didn't have anything in their background. But what that study was getting at, you think about it, it makes sense that if somebody's not had really any difficulties or like mud on their tires, like you're describing yourself, how does that person possibly relate to citizens that have all kinds of problems going on? There's a disconnect, and when the person in the community says, the cops don't understand me, there's a little bit of truth to that with an applicant that's totally lily white. The other thing that comes through that research is, you would say, has this person ever really had to demonstrate that they were resilient and could bounce back from things? If life's been a smooth sail all the way through, it gets very difficult to figure out, well, how's he going to respond, he or she, when they get out into the police world and there's all kinds of things that knock them down every day? Are they going to be able to bounce back from difficulty? So it's really, that research has made me rethink how I evaluate applicants, that it's kind of, if you think of threading the needle, I don't want the person necessarily that's lily white. I also don't want the person that's had repeated problems over and over and never learned from them and matured. I want somebody who's had a little bit of difficulty, but then has shown what the researcher called a redemptive period, where they've righted their ship from some of the issues that they used to have. I think that makes for the best police officer.
Yeah, I look at it as, like you said, you have this, you've been put in hot water before, and it can, and then you're able to. And I hate to throw my poor brother into this, but we talk about it all the time. He is a few years older than I am, and he's just had a more difficult time, I feel, processing our background. And he told me, his therapist told him, and he used this analogy, he said, your pot, the water has boiled out of it. The pot's just on the stove, just burning. And he said, your brother just took the pot of water off. And I was like, well, I don't know if that's necessarily true, but I was like, I don't regard that to be something that, I use it as a barometer to get, like you said, on the job, I look at someone and I thankfully my department recognizes it, but they're like, you're compassionate when you're talking to someone, and you're able to relate to them a little bit different. Even though I've never been addicted to, heroin, or I've never been arrested, I can still relate to them on some degree.
Right.
And I'm thankful for that. I don't know if it's God. I don't know if it's, if that's just fate and you're born into whatever life, which that's a good topic of discussion too.
Life? Let's dig into life.
Oh, well, so I grew up in so my mother was just she heavily disabled. She died at 54.
Man,
young.
I'm sorry.
Well, no, she suffered. And so my family, my aunt and uncle, they took us in for a brief period. My uncle wasn't. My aunt was in church Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, Saturday, but outside of church, she was this hateful woman. And so, and her daughter was the same way. And, several other family members, they'd be in church on Sunday, and then, they'd get home and they were just totally different. At least to us, we were like Harry Potter, the room under the cupboard type, the stairwell. Right. So it put a bad taste in my mouth with religion, and then but I grew up in that, so I thought, God had nothing to do with that. But then as I get older, I contemplate like being open-minded to where I'm thinking, okay, well, I read a powerful quote one time, and it's not perfectly true. But every man's religion is the local religion. Have you ever heard that?
Yeah.
So, and I thought about it. I was like, well, okay, I grew up in South Georgia, and
Collard greens and sweet tea.
Yeah.
What kind of religion did you develop out of that, do you think?
I just had an interview with a pastor, and he and I talked about it. He is a non-denominational pastor, very nice guy, and we talked about it, and I said, I feel like I'm on the outer cusp of Christianity, but also at the same time, like, it's hard, and I've talked to our chaplain about it. I've talked to just a bunch of different people, And I was like, the older I get, the more I feel like I need this concrete, hard evidence. Like God's like, here I am. But then, I was talking to someone and they said, well, Jesus said, if you're lukewarm, I'll spit you out.
Yeah.
So you need to be
Well, and
one or
think
the other.
about the job of a police officer where you're around hurt and evil and
Yeah.
all kinds of things that, in our human flesh, we say, if there's a good God up there, why would he allow these things to happen? So I think police work itself, for some officers, causes them to have less trust in a higher power. But another way of thinking about it, I'm going to try to give you a little therapy here this afternoon.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding.
But it
Go
goes
ahead.
back to the difference between your brother and you. Our field is starting to study a lot, Andrew, of what's called post-traumatic growth.
Okay.
Not post-traumatic stress disorder. Sounds bad and horrible. Post-traumatic growth. And what it's getting at is there are some people who take the mindset that, I have some traits, some abilities, some skills as an adult that really are good and benefit me, and I'm proud of those things. And if I'm really being honest with myself, I would confess they came out of having been through that horrible traumatic event. Now, that's not discounting that it was horrible. You don't become Pollyannish and deny that things were hard. But I think healthy people can take something from that and say, but for that traumatic event, I'm not sure I would have had that. And to go back to the spiritual angle, that's frankly biblical, because in Romans it says that God takes all things and uses them for his purposes, or uses them for good for those that believe. It doesn't say he takes nice, shiny, pretty, two intact parents with a picket fence and uses that for good. It says he takes all things. And so there's another place in the Bible where it says, count it all joy, right? Count all of your experiences as joy. And I think what it's getting at is the good is joyous because it's good, and even the bad is probably, if you're minded like I'm just suggesting here, will eventually lead to some good. And all of us can think about things that we've been through at some point in our life that, at that moment was horrible.
Yeah.
And years later, you're like, like an example I'll give, and I know this is probably pretty low key, but I went through a divorce in my 20s. And at the time, it was horrible. I thought life had ended, right? Like, but now, if somebody comes into my office and is going through marital difficulty or a divorce, I know kind of where they've been, and I feel like I can relate and have some credibility that had I never been through that, I don't think I would have that now. It's kind of like, why are 12-step AA groups usually facilitated by somebody who's a recovering alcoholic? They've tried to use their negative history for good.
Yeah, it's a very, very, no truer words have been spoken, I feel like, So, post-traumatic growth, the problem I see, not in that, but the problem I see is people, they start wallowing in self-pity.
Yeah.
So, that creates, I feel like and then I'm like, and I tell people, I'm like, you're telling yourself you're content to stay in this realm of negativity or poverty or addiction, whatever the case. I don't know. It's a very interesting concept, because that's what I look at is, and then with my psych eval, the MMPI, was that the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory.
Yeah.
Thing that hasn't been revised since the 40s, probably.
No, I'm going to correct you.
Okay.
It actually caused a big hubbub because we had to update our tests. It got updated here just a few years ago.
Really?
So now there is the MMPI 3.
Okay. Well, I took the second.
I'm sure you took the 2, which, yes, had not been updated in a long time. Yeah. But now there is the 3, and it's the most recent version.
Well, I was told that, I guess I'm a resilient person.
Okay.
I don't know what they gleaned from those random. I like flowers. What is the Is it? Hey, I'm gonna throw some random darts at this guy, and then I'm gonna hit him with the vital ones and see if he answers consistently throughout, or.
It's not as random as you would think, and actually, it's a lot more sophisticated than you would think. So, for instance, in the original development of the test, as I understand it, they took a huge test bank of questions, many more than you actually took on the test, which I know was a lot. But when they began this, they had a huge test bank of questions. And I think the rationale at the time was, let's start giving these test questions to known samples of people. So we're going to give it to people that are highly introverted and see how they respond to these questions. People that are highly extroverted. But also, let's give it to people who are in the hospital clinically depressed, people that have PTSD, people that have anxiety, people that have drug and alcohol problems, people that have schizophrenia. And let's see how they respond to these items. And what they discovered over time is that each of those groups kind of has their own unique way of viewing those questions and responding to them. So something like, true or false, I like flowers. Well, there's a scale on the test that measures people that have aesthetic interests versus mechanical interests. If you like flowers, you're probably also somebody that likes the symphony and creative things like music. If you say false, I don't like flowers, you're probably going to be on the other end of I like to tinker on cars. I like to be out in the woods hunting, more masculine interests. So over time, what happens is they hone these questions into different groups and how they respond to them. They take a random guy, Andrew, have him take the test and see, you could think of it as like goodness of fit. Does he fit any of these known categories, either in part or in full? And it helps us give a picture about who you might be.
Okay. I knew there was something.
There's some science to it.
I knew there was something behind the curtain.
And what's really cool nowadays is the research has gotten so sophisticated, back to the police topic here, is it shows there are certain traits that if that person gets on the job, here's likely what you're going to see from them on the job. So there's correlations that are now in the research that show both good and bad. Like this, I'm not going to go into the traits because it's copyrighted material, but there's certain traits that correlate with this person is much more likely to get involved in excessive force. This person is much more likely to not show up at court and be absent. This person is much more likely to have an off-duty conduct problem. But also, here's the traits that predict this person is probably going to have good relationships with the community. This person's likely to get commendations down the road. This person's likely to get promoted down the road. So being able to look at that test, which, like you're saying, on the surface just looks like we're throwing darts, it's actually a lot more sophisticated than people realize.
Okay. Yeah. And in the military, I took the C sort. And it was, I don't even think they do it now because it was hard to tell when someone goes through that pipeline. I mean, are they going to get they break their leg and now they can't continue? But it was it was very similar. So I'm glad I remembered to bring that up to you.
And they still let you in the military after you took the test?
Yeah, they still let me in.
They had pity on you.
Well, I tell you what I did fail. I failed the depth perception and I failed the vision test.
Yep.
And so I went and got LASIK a week before I shipped out to boot camp. And at MEPS, there was this outdated, like, you look in like a microscope and there's dots. Yeah. Which dot's closer? And I'm like, so I Christmas tree this thing. Yeah. Failed. Yeah. Well, for special operations, you have to pass a depth perception test. So I went to a civilian doctor. He's like, no, that's outdated. He said, close one eye, one laser will go horizontal, one will go vertical, and I want you to tell me when they intersect. So I tell him, he's like, you pass with flying colors. But he had to send that to Bethesda Hospital and Bethesda, Maryland, the Naval Hospital. They have to okay it. They have to send it back to MEPS. I never found out what happened with that. I had some just administrative hang-ups, but...
Given that and your experience with the MMPI, have you developed like test anxiety over the years?
I had this, I guess what truly helped me was, and we don't have this problem unfortunately anymore, when I went through it was get as many irons in the fire as you can.
Oh, okay.
And that way, if one says no, another says yes, maybe. And that's not to hide anything, to be deceptive. It's just, that's the law of the land.
Well,
sometimes.
Even back to the police recruitment thing, there are some applicants that realize, okay, Department A has very strict hiring standards. Department B doesn't, because applicants talk to each other.
Oh, yeah.
And so you very much get people that do the shotgun approach on applying to different departments out of the hope that one of them will pick them.
Yeah.
I personally know of, I just learned about this yesterday, there was a department that had, but she'll go nameless, who had a couple guys in the last year that were terminated for significant alcohol problems.
Yeah.
That just got hired at another department.
I read stories about this stuff all the time. I get emails, and it just makes me wince and think, wow. Like you were talking about the just kind of red flags in their personnel file, and they go to another agency, and like one agency, I don't remember where, I think it was in Michigan. The guy was on his 6th department in 4 years. By the time you get through field training, and I mean, not going through the academy again even, I mean, that's just like getting there and going. Now,
I think the story that you're talking about was a guy that was ultimately involved in an excessive force or a wrongful shooting, or at least it's a questionable shooting.
He is still employed to this day.
Yeah. I read that same article and I thought, man.
The sheriff of the prior agency, his 5th agency, was begging the new department, like, hey, don't take this guy.
Yeah.
Don't take this guy. And they were like, well, I mean, I don't know.
And then you think, well, if this person that he shot, I don't remember if they survived or not, if their family sues the officer, you know, that speaks for itself, but there's also a negligent hiring liability on the department of, like, if you knew all this stuff and you hired him anyways, isn't there some liability to be borne there as well? I would argue that there is.
I definitely would too, because I mean, at the end of the day, it's, you know, when you take on that administrative role, or you're the chief, or you're in charge of you know, I mean, generally it's a collaborative effort now, but it's also, I mean, the chief has the final say, and then, you know, like, but, you know, the psychologist says, hey, look, like you were saying, like, I can't endorse this particular person.
And as you may know, not every department requires a psychological evaluation.
I didn't know that.
So that's a dirty little secret that, and I'll pick on Indiana here for a little bit. We are one of only 13 states that does not have codified standards for what a department is supposed to do when they hire somebody. So lucky us, you know, there are some folks that apply at departments knowing I won't have to pass a psych eval, and that's why they're applying to the department, because they've often applied at other departments and failed the psych eval, so they just move on and go to a different department where they know that's not going to be a hurdle they're going to have to cross. And I think the danger in that is not only do you have somebody that's potentially unsafe out there, like this guy you're talking about from Michigan, when his story makes the news, what does it do? It tarnishes all police officers, that they're all hillbillies, and so...
This particular officer I'm talking about, I mean, he is a minority. I don't know if we're talking about the same guy or not. He just seemed to have a problem with, like, he'd came into work one day and he was just carrying a totally different service weapon. And they were like, what are you doing? And it was like this massive, like, Dirty Harry, you know, and just crazy off the wall stuff. And, you know, then again, thankfully, and I think you'll agree with this, that's not the norm. I can't remember exactly where we left off at, but it has been a really good discussion so far, and very, I knew it would be good. I will say, growing up in the group homes, I had so many. It was mandatory. You had to go to a psychiatrist, psychologist, and I was on Wellbutrin and Adderall and Concerta, and I think the Wellbutrin was for tobacco cessation. Your approach is really good.
Well, appreciate that.
That's vague, but
I think I've met so many clients over the years that come in and say, you know, I went and saw a psychologist or a counselor at one point, and I didn't think it was very helpful at all. And I'll say, well, kind of describe the experience. What do you remember about it? And I'll frequently hear, they just kind of sat there and looked at me. Like I felt like an ape, and the other person was Jane Goodall looking at me like, What's this monkey gonna do?
Yeah.
Say something, monkey. And so I think, and this probably comes from my spiritual beliefs, that the best therapists are people that are actively involved in the conversation. And so I've sometimes had to tell people when they come in to see me for the first time, hey, if you've worked with other counselors, you're probably going to find me a little more direct. It doesn't have anything to do with you. That's just my style, because I think if people had all the answers themselves, they wouldn't be coming to see us. They're oftentimes looking for some guidance, some wisdom, some suggestions. I mean, every once in a while I'll meet somebody who comes to see me just because they need a place to vent. And I truly can sit back and for an hour not say anything if that's what the person needs.
Yeah.
But the majority of people are coming in saying, I need some help. What do I do? And if I sit back and say, well, what do you think you should do? That can push a lot of people away.
Yeah, I and you can correct me on this. I feel like sometimes that can be a good, just kind of getting them to provoke their own thoughts.
At times, yes.
But then there's times where it's like, what do you mean? What if I knew the answer to that, I wouldn't. It's like when you lose something, someone's, where's the last place you had it? Like, if I knew that, I wouldn't be.
And is there any other service, like, do you go into the mechanic and they say, well, what do you think we should do with your car? I mean,
get me a new one. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, you're exactly. It's like, I could just stare in the mirror and not come here, or I could, But then again, I could see how that's useful. I mean, just saying, hey, you know this problem inside and out. You've mulled it over in your head 1,000,001 times. What's the Venn diagram you came up with?
Yeah, and I guess I should police myself a little bit here. I also had to be careful that I don't go so directive that now I'm the person that helps this person solve every single one of their problems, because that's not what a psychologist should be doing.
I almost called you and asked you what I should wear.
Really?
No, it's just like...
And yet you wore that?
Oh, no, it's terrible.
But there is a fine line, admittedly, between me taking the lead and being responsible for someone else's life versus me offering some suggestions and saying, like you said, what are things that you've thought of? I might add in there, have you thought about trying this or that? Because all of us have blind spots, right?
Yeah.
Things that don't even occur to me that I should maybe be trying to assist in my situation. So I feel like I give a second opinion, maybe.
Yeah, you can be a sounding board, or and with psychology or with your profession, are you trying to teach people how to think differently or maybe engage differently?
Long term, yes.
Long term, okay.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of times we see people that are in acute crisis, so we're just trying to stabilize them however we can.
Okay.
Yes, you're absolutely right that you want to instill in them after you got through the crisis. Let's think about how we got through that crisis. And did we think of some ways that you could maybe apply that process to other things that happen in your life? You definitely want to go into the process itself once you get through the emergency, whatever that happens to be.
Okay. Well, one more thing, and then I think we can close this out. I'm gonna pick on you for a second.
Okay.
Not you particularly, but as a psychologist, what are things that you struggle with?
Compassion fatigue.
What is that? I mean, I can kind of tell from the name, but...
Yeah, so I learned early in my career that I would come home from a day of work where, let's say I saw 6, 7 people, and all we're doing is sitting on a couch talking to each other, right? And I would get home from work and feel exhausted.
I bet.
And I would think, how can I be that tired? I was just sitting on a chair talking with people. It's not like I was roofing a house, right? But I started to learn that, okay, I have a lot of empathy for people.
Yeah.
And what that means is when they're hurting, I'm kind of hurting a little bit with them.
I see.
And so, like police work, you don't have people coming in to see you generally because everything's going great. It's layers of crap that's going on in their life. And so I don't think that most grad schools prepare the students that when you get out in the field, you're going to have to make sure you take care of yourself, especially if you're a highly empathetic person, because this is going to drain on you. And so compassion fatigue just means, you know, with every client that you see, there's a little bit that's pulled out of you. And what do you have left in the tank at the end of the day or the end of the week? There's a joke that if you really want your psychologist to pay attention to you, you better come on Monday. Because by the time you get to Friday, they're fresh out of any compassion. They're tired. And so I think that that's probably the one thing I struggle with the most.
Yeah, it sounds like that makes a lot of sense, because I'll talk to someone on a call for an hour, just being compassionate.
Yep.
I care. I'm like, hey, and then, you know, you leave that call and you're like, I mean, for me, I'm just like, whew, man.
Yeah.
So 30 to 35 people a week. Okay, well, at least you have the awareness of it. You know it. That's.
I didn't recognize it at first. It took a while to realize what was happening. Because at first I was like, am I just not getting enough sleep? Do I need more coffee? It didn't matter what I tried. I'd still be exhausted. And sometimes I still am, depending on what the day is like.
Yeah, I could see. What are you doing to combat that? Just.
So the things I do is I try to make sure that when I'm outside of this office, I don't hang out with anybody that's a psychologist. I need a slice of like regular people that are not hearing problems. It's sort of like the same advice we give to police officers. When you're not on duty, try to have friends that don't work as police officers to give you a little perspective on life and bring you back down to earth, right?
Yeah.
I try to make sure that I get more walks and hikes in than vegging on the couch watching Sports Center. My faith is important to me. Music is a good outlet for me. And honestly, I think I mentioned it earlier, I have 2 psychologists in this office that we talk with one another. Hey, you're not going to believe what this client said to me. And they do the same thing with me, but it's a good outlet so that it's not keeping stored up in there. We kind of are each other's therapists, if you think of it that way.
I was going to ask you that, how, you know, I feel like I've heard, at least for other psychologists, they go and have their own, you know, therapist.
Yeah, there's been a few times in my career where I've sought out my own therapist if I thought that it was really building up more than was healthy.
Yeah. Well, I think that was it. I was going to ask why the DSM, are we on 5 now? DSM 5? Yeah. Why does that keep updating? Just they're finding new...
I think it's people that are bored and looking for something to do.
I didn't know. I was like, I'll ask him that. But that was just a quick little tidbit. But
somebody somewhere is probably getting paid for each edition that comes out, so there's some financial incentives to it. But also, the science gets better in certain things. There are political movements that change what we diagnose. I mean, way back on DSM-1, homosexuality was a mental health condition.
Wow.
Now it's not. PTSD didn't used to be in the DSM because that was all around like pre-Vietnam.
Yeah.
It gets updated a lot of times for very sound, good reasons.
Okay. Well, that was all I had. That was awesome. I'm really glad and thank you for having me. I'll tell you that at the beginning.
This is your first road show on podcasting?
Oh, yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I go to, like I was telling you earlier, I go to Los Angeles at the end of the month. I'll find something out there maybe, but...
I'll be curious to see if you go from mortuary, coroner, psychologist. How low are you going to go here?
Because I keep working my way down. No. I just like to find any and everybody that I'm like, if I can sit down and talk with this person for an hour, I will be more than happy to do it. So
you're always welcome here, brother.
Thank you.